Let me start with thanking IPK and all the organizers for inviting me to give you the opportunity to present the work we're doing in the observatory in the EUIPO. I'm going to tell you one thing that I noticed last night. We went for dinner, and as we were walking back to the hotel, we went by this food market. They sang and were very merry and happy. But the interesting thing happened after we left that food market. Just next to it, there were some guys on the street just selling sneakers. And they might have been genuine, I don't know, but we faced the same problem in Alicante. So every time we have a meeting, we have someone coming up saying that they saw someone selling counterfeits on the street. And that's why it's so important that we have these meetings. We talk about the collaborations because it is an issue. As Mr. Duprat mentioned, it is a serious problem, both for the economy, but also for right holders and the loss of jobs within the EU, but also internationally. So before I get into our work, I might just want to explain a bit what the observatory is. So EUIPO, you know what that is, hopefully. It's the European agency that registered trademarks and designs. The observatory have the second leg on that. So once you have a registered right, the observatory works in 3 legs to protect that right or help right holders and law enforcement authorities to take care of that right. So one leg, as Mr. Duprat mentioned, is the studies we do. And those are basically the backbone of all the activities we do after that. So we do these studies that shows the cost of IP infringement, the importance of protecting it, and also quantifying the infringements. The second leg is awareness-raising activities. So we do campaigns based on these studies. We see where to target and send out messages to those target groups. The third leg is to help law enforcement authorities and right holders with certain tools. One being the IP enforcement portal. So that's basically what we do in the observatory. What we also do is set up specific expert groups just to look into certain issues. One being the expert group on cooperation with intermediaries. Which one? There we go. So the expert group on intermediaries. So I know we're here today to talk about online intermediaries and online platforms, but it's important to know that these criminals, they don't misuse just online platforms and e-commerce platforms. They misuse a variation of different intermediary services. So we have created an expert group on intermediaries where we have, expert has to apply to join. They're not there in their capacity from the company they work or organization, but they're there as special experts. And as you can see, we cover all type of intermediary services. We have done several discussion papers, and my presentation today will follow kind of that structure, because the way to understand how these criminal works is to look at the intermediary services that they are misusing. So one step is to map the ecosystem. So how does these intermediary services work? What are the trends and challenges intermediary services, but right holders and law enforcement encounter when these to actually enforce right in these services? And then what we're here for today, what are the existing good practices in form of voluntary rules and regulations that the intermediary services have set up, and in terms of collaborations such as the MOU or target operations. So as you can see, we We have already written discussion papers on domain names, payments, social media, transport and logistics, and app stores. A paper will be published very shortly on online search. And we're currently working on a paper on online ads. So all these papers kind of follow the same structure, as I said. So a mapping of the ecosystem. Who are the different players? What are the trends that we can see? So how are these IP infringers misusing the service to avoid detection, or how to make money? Challenges into enforcing the IP rights, and then good practices set in place. What I want to mention, though, as well, is that we have, as you can see, we've done papers on automated content recognition as well, which is basically different technical solutions, that IP right holders can use to be able to detect the misuse of their content. We wrote a paper on live event piracy that was actually used by the Commission as a base for the new recommendation on live event piracy. And then we did a paper on e-commerce, and that's one that I want to comment especially on. So e-commerce we didn't produce a discussion paper on that because we realized that there was a gap in what we could do. Or a gap, it was a possibility that we could do more than to just write a paper. So actually the office created a strategic project. So phase one of that was to aggregate or create a repository of all IP protection programs offered by the major e-commerce platforms. So we have that online on our website. The second phase was to invite them to the IP enforcement portal. So the IP enforcement portal is a portal between right holders and law enforcement authorities where they can exchange information. Right holders can also apply for IAFAs, so an application for action. And now they can contact, e-commerce can contact right holders and exchange information there as well. The third phase of that project will be for e-commerce to connect to law enforcement authorities as well. I'm not sure how I am with time, but you let me know, no? Yeah, good. So let's move on. So collaboration is very important, but to get there, we need to also identify the trends and challenges. Why is it important? So looking at these different papers we've done, I'm not going to go through them all because that would take all day, probably one more day. But we find a couple of trends that are similar between these different services. So if we look at e-commerce, for example, drop shipping is something that is quite common when it comes to e-commerce, which is the seller creates an account with the e-commerce and never take care of the goods. So the seller can't actually see what they're selling. So they take in orders from their customers, and they place an order themselves within an e-commerce or a provider, and the goods never come to the seller's hands. So in a way, they don't control. So they have no idea if the goods are fake or not. Well, they probably have, but potentially not. You also have third-party forwarding services. And this is more when it comes to transport and logistic services. So what this means is that you have companies offering a service whereby a buyer in the EU might not be able to get a good shipped from China, for example. So they offer this service that we buy it for you, or you ship it to us, rather, and then we ship it to you. So they have like they're acting as a middleman. And funny enough, if you then look at apps, they have developed this even further. So you have these provider of apps who actually acts like a shopping agent. So you go into the app, they have services, so it could be in e-commerce in China. You don't know what the listings are. They translate it for you, and then you place the order in the app. It gets to this shopping agent. They send you a picture on it saying, is this what you wanted? And then repackage it and send it to you. Normally, so this is perfectly legitimate, yeah? But you have providers that actually has taken this further and offering counterfeit goods, whereby they send you a picture, is this the counterfeit you wanted? We're going to repackage it for you and send it back to home to you. Then, when it comes to piracy apps and live event piracy, so here the business model here varies a bit. So you have services that are completely subscription based, so you have to pay a fee to access certain material. Some are mixed, so some parts are subscription, so premium content, whilst other content can be for free. Or they are for free completely, but then the revenue comes in from ads. So we'll talk about that later when it comes to the MOU, but basically these sites and apps are sponsored by genuine brands or piracy services, and that's how they earn their money. And then cyber and typo squatting, we see that as well. That kind of phenomenon is existing in different areas. So domain name is the easy one. Typo squatting, benjamin.com or bemamin.com. So you just misspell it. It's also when it comes to apps. So you have either they kind of rip off a company that doesn't have an app, and they create their own app and then mislead the client to think that it's a genuine company, but once you log into the app, your credential will be stolen or you get offered a piracy service. Or they create apps that are very similar to genuine apps, and in that way kind of mislead the consumer to download that app. So these are more the kind of activities and business models. But the interesting way is, how do they kind of evade detection? A lot is the appearance of being genuine. Yeah? So this is ads, websites, apps. That activity is not identical through these different intermediary services, but the purpose is the same. So for example, when it comes to apps, one activity could be to kind of hide malicious code from reviewers, or you just create an app that is genuine, and then you do an update to it, and that's when the illegal activity appears. You can also use less regulated countries or regions. So transport and logistics, we've seen that counterfeiters are misusing free trade zones. Yeah? So they send their goods to the free trade zones, they mislabel it there or change labels, and then transport the goods further away. When it comes to, for example, live event or apps, you use these type of bulletproof hosting services. So it could be hosting services that are located in countries and regions that is less regulated and isn't as active in enforcement. When it comes to small parcels and unbranded goods, that's also when it comes to kind of transport and logistics and e-commerce, you have the use. So when you use small parcels, when you get detected, or if you get detected, the loss is less, you know, instead of shipping a whole container. It's also more difficult for the postal service to kind of detect all this amount of parcel that being sent. And then unbranded goods. So if you send I don't know, Canadian Goose, you don't use this here maybe as much as in Sweden, but Canadian Goose is a very thick kind of winter coat. But if you take away the brand from that, it looks like any other coat, potentially. I mean, they might have design, but just for the sake of argument. So they send these unbranded jackets, and obviously in customs, they will see them and say, okay, well, it's not branded, so we'll ship it further. And then in a small parcel, you have all the labels. And then they might go to a free trade zone where it's sewn on and then shipped again. Hidden links. So, and this is connected with the use of different services as well. So hidden links is not hidden in that sense, but you can have a social media post, or you can have a e-commerce listing. But then they use a different service, like a communication service, so WhatsApp or Messenger on social media, to send instruction how to interact with that ad. So click here, you use the code XYZ, and that will actually give you access, or not access, but it actually will prompt the seller on the other side to send you the specific good rather than what's in the ad. So they're very tricky, and what we have to realize is that they don't just use one service or one intermediary service. They misuse several during the entire step. Challenges. So this is actually a big part of also for the right holders, but also for the intermediary services and law enforcement authorities. Given the international scale of these groups, it's very hard for right holders to kind of keep track of everything, and law enforcement authorities. And especially when you have different jurisdictions and different rules in different jurisdictions. Yeah? So monitoring and detection. If we take apps as an example, compared it to websites, so when you monitor the web for an infringing site, it's almost on the face value of that site. So when you send a crawler out and say, look, this is my brand, if you see this brand on any other website than mine, I want to know about it. When it comes to apps, normally you can't see what's happening in the app on the face value of the app. So they don't. We've seen an example where they create apps for the sole purpose of selling counterfeits. And it's actually in the metadata as well. So they describe the app as an app to sell counterfeits or to buy counterfeits. But that is taken down by the App Store quite quickly because obviously their terms and conditions says that they can't have apps on their store selling counterfeits. The problem with the other apps is that you need to download them and use them to be able to see what the infringement is. So for right holders or their representatives, it's very difficult to you need to scan the store, you need to try to find out which apps are suspects, download them, and then go into the app and search for the infringement. And depending on jurisdictions, you have also different rules. So if I can find an app in Manila, doesn't necessarily mean that I can take it down in Sweden, because there's different rules and jurisdictions in these app stores as well. So you can't take down one and every other version of that app disappears. I mentioned use of private groups, yeah, and that's a big thing as well. These private groups, and you have other rules coming in there, like the right for privacy and those type of rules, because it's not as easy to have to get access to these type of chat groups. You can apply for them, and sometimes you get accepted. But it's very difficult, and it requires a lot more work. Yeah, so that's an issue for right holders. In terms of monitoring and detection as well, if we look at live piracy, they require a quick takedown. So for live piracy, if it's a football game and you haven't taken it down within, well, I would say 10 minutes, it's very detrimental to the right holder. Yeah? So they require a very quick takedown process, which sometimes is very difficult depending on what type of relationship they have with the hosting provider and the website and the registrar and registry. Use of VPN and other proxy services. That's also something that we've seen with domain names, but ads and app stores as well, or apps, is that one app can function, it could be the identical app, but it functions a completely different way in Manila, for example, than it would do in Spain. And it's just because of proxy settings that they put in place. Sometimes they even collaborate with other hosting providers with actually host the content, that so they set the limit or the restriction to access certain countries in certain content in certain countries. I've touched upon it a bit. Different rules depending on jurisdiction. Here we come to notice and action. We will discuss that a bit more in detail when it comes to good practices. But here again, most of these online platforms have different rules depending on which country you're in, which is natural, yeah? Because you have national legislation, you need to prove your right in that country. One issue that was really pointed out when we did the app study is that, especially for apps, but you have it for websites as well, is that even if an app store removes an app from the store, it doesn't disappear from the user's phone or device. So they can still access it. So even if you remove it from the store, which is good, no one else can use it, but the damage is already done because you have X amount of people who have it already on their device. I'm going to mention it during good practices, but there are actually examples of where stores have been able, or they can delete an app from a user device. But normally that doesn't occur when it comes to IP infringement, but it's other type of issues like privacy and security and stuff like that. Information sharing. Here again, we'll talk about it this afternoon, but it's not so much. Well, there is an issue as well, at least in the EU, what you can share. We have a GDPR, which is a regulation on what type of information you can share about personal information. It's not so much about that, because if you're a criminal and it's a criminal activity, you can share that information. But it's what the intermediary services want to get from right holders and from law enforcement authorities. Because all this information that they can receive are then used by them in their risk assessment and monitoring activities, like we're going to see later on. So it's very important that we all collaborate about this, because if one helps the other, then it can go further. Yeah? So it's not just, one player is not just alone. It needs to be a collaboration across stakeholders. And that just brings me back to my first point. I know we're here today to talk about online platforms, but it's not just online platforms like social media and e-commerce that are misused for these type of activities. Payment industry, transport and logistics. You have a lot of other players that we need to involve in this work to be able to combat it effectively. And I don't know if I did 40 minutes. Was I too quick? Around, okay. Well, it's a good thing that we were a bit late. I could talk about this a bit more, but I wanted to give the opportunity for the people in the audience maybe to ask a couple of questions. Is that okay? Or online. I don't know if we can have people online saying something as well. But yeah, if you have any questions, let me know.